On the morning of August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, above the city of Hiroshima, Japan, the sky is clear and almost impossibly calm. Beneath the aircraft moving silently through the high atmosphere, thousands of people begin another ordinary day. Shopkeepers open their doors. Workers move through crowded streets. Children prepare for school. Bicycles roll across bridges. Trams travel along familiar routes. The city wakes beneath the summer sun, unaware that in a matter of seconds, its entire existence is about to change. High above the ground, a United States Army Air Forces bomber approaches from the south. Inside the aircraft, the crew watches instruments and waits for the exact moment that has been planned for months. The mission is not like any other bombing raid of the Second World War. This aircraft carries a weapon unlike anything humanity has ever created. The bomber is the B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay. Its target is Hiroshima, a military center, industrial city, and transportation hub that has remained largely untouched by the devastating air raids that have destroyed many other Japanese cities. The reason is deliberate. American planners want to measure the effect of a new weapon against an intact urban environment. At 8:15, the bomb bay doors open. A weapon called Little Boy falls away from the aircraft. For approximately 43 seconds, it descends through the morning air. Then, at an altitude of around 600 meters above the city, it detonates. In an instant, a flash brighter than the sun tears across Hiroshima. A fireball expands outward with unimaginable force. A shock wave races through streets and buildings. Temperatures near the center of the explosion reach extreme levels, instantly destroying everything within the immediate area. A towering column of smoke and debris rises into the sky, transforming the peaceful morning into one of the most significant and devastating moments in human history. The explosion lasts only seconds, but its consequences will continue for generations. The weapon that has arrived above Hiroshima is not simply a larger bomb. It represents the beginning of the nuclear age, the result of years of scientific discovery, industrial effort, military urgency, and a race against time during the darkest years of the Second World War. To understand why such a weapon was created, it is necessary to return to the years before Hiroshima, when scientists and governments discovered that the smallest particles of matter contained a terrifying possibility. For centuries, atoms were believed to be the fundamental building blocks of the universe. They were considered indivisible, the smallest pieces of existence itself. But by the early 20th century, physicists had begun to uncover a different reality. Inside atoms were smaller particles, and within the nucleus at the center of each atom was an enormous amount of energy waiting to be released. In 1938, German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann conducted experiments that revealed nuclear fission, the process in which the nucleus of a heavy atom such as uranium splits into smaller parts and releases energy. Physicist Lisa Meitner and Otto Frisch correctly explained the significance of this discovery, recognizing that a chain reaction could theoretically release an enormous amount of power. The possibility was both fascinating and frightening. If controlled, nuclear reactions could transform energy production. If uncontrolled, they could create a weapon unlike any before it. As Europe moved towards war, scientists began to fear that Nazi Germany might attempt to develop such a weapon first. In 1939, Albert Einstein and physicist Leo Szilard sent a letter to United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt, warning that Germany's research could potentially lead to the creation of powerful new bombs. The result was the creation of an American program that would eventually become known as the Manhattan Project. At first, the idea seemed almost impossible. Creating a nuclear weapon required solving scientific problems that had never been faced before. Scientists needed to understand how to produce enough suitable nuclear material, how to separate rare isotopes, and how to design a mechanism capable of creating a controlled explosion at precisely the right moment. The challenge was not simply scientific, it was industrial. The quantities involved were enormous. Entire facilities had to be constructed. Thousands of workers had to be recruited. Vast resources had to be committed while the world was already consumed by global conflict. The United States government eventually gathered some of the greatest scientific minds of the era. Under military leadership from General Leslie Groves and scientific direction from physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project became one of the largest secret operations in history. At its peak, more than 100,000 people were involved in the project, although only a small number understood its ultimate purpose. Major facilities were established across the United States, including Oak Ridge in Tennessee, where uranium enrichment took place, and Hanford in Washington State, where plutonium production was developed. The project consumed billions of dollars in wartime spending and transformed isolated areas into massive scientific and industrial centers. But even after years of work, success was far from guaranteed. Scientists faced enormous uncertainty. They did not know with complete confidence whether their designs would function. They did not know whether the required materials could be produced in sufficient quantities. They did not know whether the weapon would change the course of the war. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the first nuclear device was tested during the Trinity test. At 5:29 in the morning, the desert suddenly became brighter than daylight. The explosion confirmed that the scientists had achieved what many had once considered impossible. A new force had entered human history. Only weeks later, that force would be used against a real city. By the summer of 1945, the Second World War in Europe had already ended. Nazi Germany had surrendered in May, but Japan continued fighting in the Pacific. The war against Japan had become one of the most brutal conflicts ever experienced. Battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa had demonstrated that Japanese forces were prepared to fight with extraordinary determination rather than surrender. The battle for Okinawa, fought between April and June 1945, resulted in enormous casualties. More than 12,000 American military personnel were killed or missing, while Japanese military deaths were estimated at over 70,000, with tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians also losing their lives. American planners feared that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would produce even greater losses. The planned invasion, known as Operation Downfall, was expected to require enormous numbers of troops and could potentially result in hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. The exact numbers remain debated among historians, but the anticipated cost of invasion was one of the major factors considered by American decision-makers. The atomic bomb was presented by its supporters as a way to force Japan's surrender without such an invasion. But the decision to use the weapon remains one of the most debated choices of the 20th century. On the morning of August 6th, however, those debates were still in the future. At that moment, above Hiroshima, 3 seconds after the bomb's final descent, a new chapter of history had already begun. The world would never again view war, science, or human power in the same way. The destruction of Hiroshima was not only the result of the explosive force released above the city. It was the result of a weapon designed around precision, secrecy, and a completely new understanding of warfare. The bomb, known as Little Boy, was unlike the conventional explosives that had dominated the Second World War. Traditional bombs relied on chemical reactions, using materials that burned or exploded to release energy. Little Boy relied on nuclear fission, a process occurring inside the nucleus of uranium atoms themselves. Inside the weapon was uranium-235, a rare isotope capable of sustaining a rapid chain reaction. When a sufficient amount of this material was brought together under the correct conditions, neutrons released from one splitting atom could trigger the splitting of others. In a fraction of a second, billions upon billions of atomic reactions occurred, releasing an amount of energy far beyond the scale of ordinary explosives. The design of Little Boy was relatively straightforward compared with later nuclear weapons. It used a gun-type mechanism, in which one piece of uranium was fired into another piece to create the necessary conditions for detonation. The weapon measured approximately 3 meters in length, weighed around 4 tons, and contained about 64 kilograms of uranium. However, only a small portion of that uranium actually underwent fission during the explosion. The efficiency was surprisingly low by later nuclear standards, but the energy released was still devastating. Historians estimate that Little Boy produced an explosive yield equivalent to approximately 15 kilotons of TNT. To understand that scale, consider the weapons used in previous bombing campaigns. Conventional bombs could destroy buildings and neighborhoods, but nuclear weapons change the relationship between energy and destruction. A single device could achieve what previously required hundreds or even thousands of aircraft carrying conventional explosives. The creation of Little Boy had required years of research and industrial effort. But another nuclear weapon, Fat Man, used a different design based on plutonium and required an entirely different engineering approach. The challenge of producing plutonium had been solved at facilities such as Hanford, where nuclear reactors created the material through controlled reactions. The plutonium weapon required an implosion mechanism, using precisely shaped conventional explosives to compress the plutonium core until it reached a supercritical state. This design was technically more complex, but it became the basis for the second atomic bomb used in war. The scientific achievement was extraordinary, but behind every calculation and every machine were thousands of workers whose efforts remained hidden from the public. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, enormous facilities operated day and night to separate uranium isotopes. The process required immense amounts of electricity and complicated industrial methods. The K-25 gaseous diffusion plant alone became one of the largest buildings in the world, stretching more than half a kilometer in length. Workers handled equipment without fully understanding the purpose of their work. Many knew only that they were contributing to an important wartime project. At Los Alamos, New Mexico, scientists worked under intense pressure to solve theoretical and practical problems. The isolated laboratory became a gathering place for some of the most talented physicists of the era. Among them was J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the project. He coordinated a team that included researchers from across the United States, Europe, and beyond. Their work moved at extraordinary speed because the outcome of the war appeared to depend on it. Yet the creation of the bomb also raised profound questions among those who built it. Some scientists worried about what would happen if such weapons were used. Others believed that developing the bomb was necessary to defeat Nazi Germany and end the war. After Germany's surrender, debate continued over whether the weapon should be demonstrated publicly, used against a military target, or employed against a city. Ultimately, American leaders chose to use the bomb against Hiroshima. The city had been selected partly because it had important military facilities and had not previously suffered major destruction from air raids. This allowed planners to better assess the weapon's effect. According to wartime reports, the weather was also a major factor in the final decision. Several Japanese cities were considered as possible targets, but Hiroshima had favorable conditions on the morning of August 6th. As the Enola Gay approached the city, its crew followed a carefully planned mission. The aircraft was part of the 509th Composite Group, a special unit created specifically for atomic bombing operations. The group had trained for months in secrecy, practicing long-distance flights and bomb release procedures. The B-29 Superfortress itself represented the cutting edge of Allied aviation. With 4 powerful engines, a pressurized cabin, and the ability to fly at high altitude, it was one of the most advanced aircraft of the war. The Enola Gay had departed from the island of Tinian in the Mariana Islands, a base that had become a major launching point for American bombing operations against Japan. The flight to Hiroshima covered thousands of kilometers. When the bomb was released, the aircraft immediately turned away and accelerated to escape the expected blast. The crew had been warned about the force of the explosion, but even they did not fully know what they were about to witness. Seconds later, the world changed. On the ground, the people of Hiroshima experienced a moment that many survivors later described as impossible to comprehend. There was no warning, no sound of approaching aircraft, no opportunity to escape. There was only a flash. Buildings near the center of the explosion were destroyed almost instantly. Wooden homes collapsed. Fires spread rapidly. People caught outside suffered severe burns from the intense heat. The blast wave traveled outward at tremendous speed, breaking windows and damaging structures far from the center. The exact number of deaths remains uncertain because records were destroyed along with much of the city. Historians generally estimate that approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people died immediately or within the first few months from injuries and radiation effects. By the end of 1945, the death toll had likely reached around 140,000, though estimates vary. The victims included military personnel, factory workers, elderly residents, women, and children. The explosion did not distinguish between soldiers and civilians. Among the survivors were people who would later become known as hibakusha, the Japanese term for those affected by atomic bombings. Their experiences revealed another dimension of nuclear warfare. Many survivors appeared physically unharmed immediately after the blast, only to suffer later from radiation sickness. Symptoms included nausea, fatigue, hair loss, bleeding, and increased vulnerability to disease. Scientists were only beginning to understand the long-term effects of radiation exposure. The destruction of Hiroshima shocked the world. But the war was not yet over. 3 days later, another atomic bomb would be used against the city of Nagasaki. And before Japan's surrender, humanity would witness the beginning of a new era, one in which the power to destroy entire cities could exist within a single weapon. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. The atomic bomb had achieved its immediate purpose from the perspective of American military leaders, demonstrating a level of destructive power unlike anything Japan had previously faced. But the deeper consequences were only beginning to emerge. The explosion above Hiroshima was not merely an event at the end of the Second World War. It was the moment when humanity entered the nuclear age. The destruction of Hiroshima forced the world to confront a terrifying reality. The power that had once existed only inside scientific theories had now become a weapon capable of reshaping nations, politics, and the future of warfare itself. But Hiroshima was not the only city to experience this new form of destruction. On August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb was used against Nagasaki. The weapon, known as Fat Man, was different from Little Boy. Instead of uranium, it used plutonium and relied on a far more complex implosion design. It produced an explosion estimated at around 21 kilotons of TNT, more powerful than the bomb used 3 days earlier. The original target had been the city of Kokura, but cloud cover prevented the aircraft from making the attack as planned. The bomber, Boxcar, turned towards its secondary target, Nagasaki. At approximately 11:02 in the morning, Fat Man detonated above the city. The terrain of Nagasaki, surrounded by hills, limited some of the destruction compared with Hiroshima, but the human consequences were still catastrophic. Tens of thousands of people were killed, and many more suffered injuries and radiation effects. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. For millions of people across the world, the Second World War was finally coming to an end. Yet the atomic bombings remained deeply controversial. Historians continue to debate the decision to use nuclear weapons against Japanese cities. Some argue that the bombings accelerated Japan's surrender and avoided a potentially devastating invasion of the Japanese mainland. Others argue that Japan was already close to defeat and that alternatives should have been considered. There is no surviving evidence that can completely resolve every aspect of this debate. The decision remains one of the most examined and disputed moments in modern history. What is certain is that the weapons used in August 1945 introduced a new category of warfare. Before the atomic bomb, military power was measured largely through armies, fleets, aircraft, and industrial production. After Hiroshima, a single weapon could threaten the existence of entire cities. Other nations quickly understood the significance. The Soviet Union began its own nuclear program and successfully tested its first atomic bomb in 1949. The United States continued developing more advanced weapons, including the hydrogen bomb, which was many times more powerful than the weapons used against Japan. Britain became the third country to develop nuclear weapons, conducting its first successful test in 1952. France and China later joined the group of nuclear-armed states. The nuclear arms race had begun. The weapon that had ended the Second World War became one of the central factors shaping the Cold War. Compared with the conventional weapons of the era, atomic bombs represented a dramatic change in scale. The German Phi-2 rocket, for example, had been one of Nazi Germany's most advanced weapons. It could travel hundreds of kilometers and strike targets without a pilot, but its explosive power was limited compared with nuclear weapons. Around 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched during the war, causing thousands of deaths, but each carried a conventional warhead. The atomic bomb achieved a level of destruction that required an entirely new way of thinking. The Allied bomber campaigns against Germany and Japan had involved hundreds of aircraft carrying thousands of bombs. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed large numbers of civilians and destroyed vast areas of the city, but it required an enormous operation involving hundreds of bombers. Hiroshima demonstrated that a single aircraft and a single weapon could produce destruction on a scale previously associated only with massive bombing campaigns. However, nuclear weapons were not simply larger bombs. They changed military strategy itself. The development of nuclear weapons led to the concept of deterrence, the idea that the threat of overwhelming retaliation could prevent enemies from attacking. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union built enormous nuclear arsenals, creating a situation known as mutually assured destruction. Both sides understood that a full nuclear conflict could lead to catastrophic consequences for the entire world. The shadow of Hiroshima influenced international politics for decades. The immediate battlefield effect of the atomic bomb was clear. Japan surrendered, and the war ended. But the long-term impact reached far beyond 1945. The bomb changed scientific research, military planning, diplomacy, and public understanding of technology. It also created a lasting humanitarian movement focused on nuclear disarmament. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shared their experiences around the world, warning future generations about the consequences of nuclear war. Many museums and memorials now preserve the memory of these events. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial, including the preserved remains of the building known as the Atomic Bomb Dome, stands as one of the most recognized symbols of the nuclear age. Archives preserve photographs, documents, and testimonies from survivors, allowing historians to study not only the military decision-making behind the bombings, but also the experiences of ordinary people who lived through them. The legacy of Hiroshima is also visible in the technology that followed. Nuclear research eventually contributed to civilian applications, including nuclear power generation and medical technologies. The same understanding of atomic processes that created weapons also allowed scientists to develop tools used in energy production and cancer treatment. But the destructive potential never disappeared. The 3 seconds between the bomb's release and its detonation above Hiroshima became one of the most significant moments ever created by human hands. Return to that morning, a quiet summer sky, a city beginning another day, a bomber moving through the clouds. For the people below, history arrived without warning. They did not see the scientific discoveries that made the weapon possible. They did not see the factories that produced its components, or the thousands of workers who contributed unknowingly to its creation. They only experienced the final moment, a flash of light, a wave of heat, a force beyond imagination. Yet, behind that single moment was a story of human ambition, fear, sacrifice, and discovery. The atomic bomb was created because nations believed survival depended on achieving impossible things. Scientists pushed beyond the boundaries of known physics. Engineers built machines on a scale never before attempted. Workers produced materials for a weapon whose purpose remained hidden from them. But the story of Hiroshima is not only about technology. It is about people, the thousands who lost their lives, the survivors who carried memories of destruction for decades, the scientists who struggled with the consequences of their own creation, the soldiers who carried out a mission they believed would help end a global war. The weapon that fell over Hiroshima was designed to destroy, but the memory it created became a warning of what happens when human intelligence advances faster than human wisdom, a warning that scientific achievement carries responsibility, a warning that the ability to create something extraordinary also carries the ability to cause unimaginable suffering. On that morning, in August 1945, 3 seconds separated a peaceful city from a transformed world. 3 seconds that ended one chapter of history, 3 seconds that began another, and 3 seconds that reminded humanity forever that the greatest power it can discover is not the power to destroy, but the wisdom to decide when that power must never be used again.